So in the world I would design, there would be no International Monetary Fund at all. So of course, it wouldn't be available to do any bailouts. I think that the existence of things like the IMF is one factor that encourages economies to borrow too much, to live beyond their means, rather than setting expenditure and taxes at rates that can be sustained, and therefore is absolutely a contributor to recessions and financial crises. And of course, given that view, bailing them out is the wrong policy. But the only way to not have those bailouts is to not have an IMF in the first place. Even if we didn't have an IMF, other rich countries might end up bailing out the profligate countries. We, of course, have seen that very recently with Greece and Portugal and Ireland and probably soon Spain. So there's no guarantee, but having that international institution like the IMF just makes it that much more tempting for those bailouts to occur.
I don't want to end this discussion about monetary issues without asking you the classical question. What is the optimal monetary policy in your view? Do you advocate a monetary rule, as Friedman did? What do you think about monetary competition? I don't want you to enter in great details, but if you think about this, or perhaps you have answered this kind of questions before.
Because I think it's a very hard question. I think that if you could have a central government commit itself and convince everyone that it was committed and actually get everyone to believe that and stay committed to, say, increasing the monetary base by 4% a year, period, end of story, and that's all it ever did. If it could do that, I think you would have better macroeconomic performance, significantly better macroeconomic performance. The trick, of course, is getting any government to ever announce that rule, commit to that rule, and stick to that rule. Whenever there has been central government control of the money supply, whether it's under a commodity standard like the gold standard, or whether it's via a central bank, as with the Fed and the central banks around the world, we have seen that central governments have misbehaved in one way or another. Under commodity standard, you can, of course, debase the coinage, you can devalue the parities, you can abandon the commodity standard, and so on. And of course, countries did that all the time. So having a gold standard is in no way, shape, or form a guarantee that you're going to stick to any particular kind of monetary policy. Obviously, with the central banks can inflate, can print more money, and you can get all sorts of deviations from a rule no matter what the central bank says it's going to do. If you have big government, that has big debts, that of course makes it even harder, because then there's always a temptation to monetize the debts by devaluing a fixed exchange rate or by printing lots of money under a flexible exchange rate. So I don't think it's obvious what the ideal policy is, because until we somehow address the issue of commitment, how you get a government to stick to a particular policy, it's impossible to talk about what that right policy should be. Do I think that competitive banking and free entry in banking would make sense?
Yeah, because
I think it would be an improvement. I think it would help. And yet, even then, the central government can still come in and say, you know what, we decided we don't like this system and we're going to change it. The central government can still come in and print its own money, print its own greenbacks, as the US government did in the Civil War, or something like that, and lead to a general inflation, try to monetize away its debt. It can still come in and tax the notes issued by private banks. So no system is immune from mischief if you have a central government that is tempted to engage in mischief. And of course, someone like me thinks that governments are always tempted to engage in mischief, so that makes it really hard.
Okay, but I'm not so sure that perhaps these arguments proves too much in my opinion. For example, you're so pessimistic about the government, but this doesn't prevent you from advocating drug liberalization, the ending of prohibition. This doesn't prevent us from advocating the right policy, whichever that is. Of course, the government could change his mind later and say, folks, we get back to prohibition. But when we get to monetary questions, it seems that your pessimistic view about the government somehow you put this somehow into relation with the optimal monetary policy. And these two should be, I think, clearly distinct, because the optimal monetary policy should be scientifically derived, regardless of the government behavior or his mind at one point of time or another.
So I accept your point. I guess I think my positions on those two issues are more consistent than it might have seemed, in that I think that in both cases we have to educate people to understand the limits of government policy. So in the case of a specific one like drug prohibition, I think that unless more people understand that drug prohibition causes the negatives that they typically associate with drugs themselves, okay, we're not going to get a change in policy, and that it's necessary to try to get people to understand that. In the case of macro policy, of monetary policy, I think it's important as a first step that more people are aware of the limits of active stabilization policy. If people learn first that conducting active stabilization policy is hard and has made all sorts of mistakes in the past, then they will be more suspicious about engaging in that and be more tempted to adopt a rule that they will stick to. But just trying to impose the rule to get the better policy, I think, doesn't usually work. More generally, as long as we have big government, we're going to have big debts. As long as we have big debts, we're going to be tempted to monetize. So I think rather than trying to use rules about monetary policy to get the size of government down and to get policy to be more stabilizing and less destabilizing, I think we have to get more people to agree that we should reduce the size of government and it should try to do less, and then it will become easier, okay, to design a better policy. Okay? Mm-hmm. As long as your kids believe that it's fun to go out and drink and drive, no rule is going to prevent them from going out and drinking and driving. If you can teach them and they can actually understand that drinking and driving is a bad thing, then you actually won't really need very many rules, or almost any reasonable rule will do a good job.
So the most important issue is the size of the government. This brings us to my next question, which is related to the fiscal policy. In Romania, until very recently, we had around 400 taxes. Now the government has reduced their number to 263 taxes and is planning to reduce it further to 100 taxes. Suppose you're in front of a prime minister, what would be your advice? What is your optimal fiscal system?
So I would say, assuming we can convince people to adopt it, the optimal fiscal system would have one tax rate, would have a flat tax. Ideally, that would even be a flat tax on consumption rather than on income. Although, if we could get the size of government to be as small as libertarians would like it to be, the difference between taxing consumption at a flat rate and income at a flat rate would be fairly small, okay, because that tax rate would be very, very low. But if there's one flat tax that applies to every dollar of income or every dollar of consumption, then the distortions it would induce would be very small. The rules that people were living under for how much tax they owed would be very simple and very clear. And that would minimize the distortions that arise from the taxation that occurs in order to fund government. I'm taking as given that there's still some government. There's, even in libertarian land, there's some national defense, there's some police and courts which help to enforce contracts and property rights, but compared to most governments now, it's 5% of the current size. So it is much, much smaller. If you have that small a government, designing a reasonable tax system would be pretty easy.
Okay, so it's really challenging to put libertarian philosophy in people's minds. But I don't want to anticipate, because I want to ask you a couple of more philosophical questions at the end of this interview. But what do you think attracts people to statism? Because you mentioned this earlier.